Now let us look at the public sector banks. Who are the public sector banks? I have already told the public sector banks are those in which more than 50% of the shares are owned by the central government. And I'll tell you another tip to identify a public sector bank from a private sector bank. This tip is that in all the names of public sector banks, the word limited will not be there. If you will see the name board of State Bank of India, it will be only State Bank of India. If you see the name board of Punjab National Bank, it will be Punjab National Bank. The word limited will not be there. On the other hand, if you look at ICICI Bank name board, it will be ICICI Bank Limited, HDFC Bank Limited. Any other bank, they have to add the word limited into their name. Therefore, by merely looking at the name, you can have a clue. Sometimes you may be asked to differentiate a public sector bank and a private sector bank from other banks. This you take it as a kind of clue. We have got three types of public sector banks in India. One is State Bank of India and its groups. State Bank of India, as I told, came into existence by an act of parliament by taking over the assets and liabilities of the then Imperial Bank in the year 1957. When they took State Bank of India, there were also some banks belonging to the erstwhile Maharajas. For example, Maharaja of Trivandrum had one bank, and then Nizam had a bank, and there was another bank held by Patiala, Maharaja of Patiala. All these banks were also taken over by the government, and that is why we have State Bank of, they are called State Bank of Patiala, State Bank of Travancore, State Bank of Mysore. All these banks were owned by the then erstwhile Maharajas, which were also taken over by Government of India when they were taking over the assets and liabilities of Imperial Bank and converting it to State Bank. Thus we had State Bank Group, in which the primary member is the State Bank of India, and then today we have got 5 subsidiaries. We had more than 7 or 8 subsidiaries. 4 of them have been already merged with the State Bank of India. We are now left with the State Bank of India and 5 subsidiaries. This all happened in 1957. Then another 12 years passed by. Came 1969. In 1969, Madam Indira Gandhi was the then Prime Minister. We had a Congress which was started by, which was called the original Congress, which had not been split. Subsequently, Congress had been split into Old Congress and the New Congress. But we are talking about an era when Congress was one. And at that time, the Finance Minister was Morarji Desai. And Madam Indira Gandhi wanted the banks to go to the villages and help people, but the banks were refusing to do it, and therefore she wanted to nationalize. But the then Finance Minister Morarji Desai was not willing for a nationalization because he felt any kind of government control over banks will be an interference, which was a very wise way of thinking. Then one day Morarji Desai resigned from his job. He went away, and on that day's night, a cabinet meeting was arranged, and a unanimous decision was taken to nationalize banks. So an ordinance was promulgated at 12 o'clock in the night on 19th July 1969, nationalizing banks. I have provided before you the Times of India headline of 20th July 1969, which talks about 14 top banks are nationalized. They did not nationalize all the banks. At that time there were so many banks, many of them very small. They only took about 14 banks which were having more than 70% of the deposits. And many people called it a master stroke, political master stroke, because it helped Madam Gandhi to consolidate her position in the Congress, and which later on proved the way for starting up a new Congress called Congress I. and the old Congress slowly withered away. And today what Congress we have is what is started as Congress new by Indira Gandhi. Even though many people called it as a political masterstroke, Indira Gandhi herself called it in the parliament. She said she had nationalized the banks because she wanted to have control over the commanding heights of the economy. Which were the banks that were nationalized? I have given you the list of 14 banks that were nationalized. Allahabad Bank, Bank of Baroda, Bank of India, Bank of Maharashtra, Canara Bank, Central Bank of India, Dena Bank, Indian Bank, Indian Overseas Bank, Punjab National Bank, Syndicate Bank, UCO Bank, Union Bank and United Bank of India, which were having more than 70% of the total deposit of the then banking system, which were the biggest banks, the top 14 big banks, they were brought under government control called nationalization. Then, whether nationalization proved to be a very fruitful enterprise for the economy, undoubtedly yes. Whatever may be the motives for the nationalization of banks by Madam Indira Gandhi, but the results of her action proved to be enormously beneficial for the economy. From 1969, they took 1969 banks were nationalized. It took about 2 or 3 years to organize them. They first appointed custodians, then later on they were given charge. The best thing that Madam Indira Gandhi did at that time, she never brought any government people into the bank. She made only professional bankers as custodians and chairman and managing directors, and as a result, banks started growing. She allowed these banks to grow. She asked these banks to go and open branches in all the rural areas. From 1972 to 1980, in about 8 or 9 years, the banks had shown a phenomenal growth of annual compounded growth rate of 35% year after year. Many branches were opened, large number of employees were taken, and it was a great success, unheard of in the history anywhere in the world. It's a world level success, nationalization bank. So, egged on by this success, again in the year 1980, when Mrs. Indira Gandhi came to power for the third time as Prime Minister, she brought within the ambit of nationalization 6 more banks. And thus nearly 90% of the total banking business was with the nationalized banks and public sector banks. Which are the 6 banks that were nationalized in the second tranche of nationalization? One is Andhra Bank, then Corporation Bank, New Bank of India, Oriental Bank of Commerce, Punjab and Sindh Bank, and last Vijaya Bank. Of these 6 banks, New Bank of India was, it had some problems, and subsequently it was merged with Punjab National Bank. Thus, we have first State Bank of India and its group, which is a part of the public sector bank, and the second group is nationalized bank. Under nationalized banks we have 2 sets of nationalized banks, one in 1969 14 banks and another in 1986 banks, totally 20 banks, out of which 1 bank is gone, New Bank of India. Now you have to, sometimes they will ask you how many banks were nationalized. It's a very tricky question. How many banks were nationalized? 20 banks were nationalized. How many nationalized banks are functioning today? Only 19 banks are functioning today. So you have to understand the question very clearly. In the exam they may sometimes ask how many banks were nationalized? The answer is 20. How many nationalized banks are functioning today? The answer is 19, because 1 bank, New Bank of India, was merged with Punjab National Bank.